Welcome back to Now Let's Be Honest for another episode of Is It Biblical, where we walk through each episode of The Chosen and determine which elements of the show are biblical, historical, probable, plausible, hypothetical, improbable, ahistorical, and heretical. We aren't going to waste any time getting straight to the breakdown, but before we do so, be sure to like this video to let the YouTube algorithm know that videos like this are worth watching. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you know when more videos like this are coming your way. But without further ado, I have a question for you. The Chosen, is it biblical? Season 4, Episode 4, Calm Before. Let's start with our biblical section, which accounts for anything based on information that can be found in the Bible. The first biblical thing we have in this episode is this is the way of all the earth for now. As Jesus and Peter watch Thomas anxiously pace back and forth outside of Capernaum, Jesus remarks that this is the way of all the earth for now. While this interaction is fictional, the truth Jesus expounds here is not. As Jesus will tell the apostles during the Last Supper, "In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Hardship is not a possibility in life, it is a certainty, for we live in a sinful and broken world filled with sinful and broken people, and creation itself and humanity with it groans for God to redeem and restore all things. For now, the way of all the earth is the way of death. Yet for Christians, we do not place our hope in the way of all the earth. Instead, we do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For a momentary light affliction is working out for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. One day we will look back on all our tears like old tales, and we will realize that the sorrow was shaping our heart, and the heartache we experienced brought us closer to God than joy alone ever could. The second biblical thing that we have in this episode is the inner three. During another flashback, John recalls a discussion he, Big James, and Peter had shortly after Raymond's death. While the conversation they had is fictional, they reflect on something that is biblical. There are several instances in the Gospels where Jesus pulled Peter, James, and John apart from the rest of the group and gave them special insight that the other 9 did not. We see this during the raising of Jairus' daughter in Mark chapter 5 verse 37 and Luke chapter 8 verse 51, the transfiguration in Matthew chapter 17 verse 1, Mark chapter 9 verse 2, and Luke chapter 9 verse 28, the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark chapter 14 verse 33, and the Olivet Discourse in Mark chapter 13 verse 3, though in the last instance, Andrew is present as well. What is evident from the Gospels is that while Jesus had thousands of disciples, he had 12 appointed apostles, and within those apostles, there was an inner three consisting of Peter, James, and John. In the scene, the trio referenced the raising of Jairus' daughter, which they alone witnessed, and wherein Jesus gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. This is part of the Messianic secret, which we talked about back in our video on Season 4, Episode 2. In the context of the episode, this makes things especially challenging for them, for they alone know that Jesus has the power to raise people from the dead. The third biblical thing we have in this episode is different thoughts, different ways. In that same flashback, Peter reminds the sons of thunder about God's words in Isaiah. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares Yahweh. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." That's Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. To this, Big James replies that doesn't make things any easier. To a degree, I get where he's coming from, and this is something that I've often heard from people in times of grief. However, in instances where I myself have been grieving the unexpected and sudden tragic loss of a loved one, I'd actually argue that convictions like this are precisely what made things easier for me. In fact, I'd argue that verses like this make life in general a whole lot easier because it removes any pressure we might feel to know and grasp everything in life, instead choosing to release those anxieties and burdens to the God whose ways are higher than our ways and whose thoughts are higher than our thoughts. The fourth biblical thing we have in this episode is trouble with the in-laws. In this episode, we see a brutal confrontation between Cophny and Thomas, and you can feel the pain of both men seeping through the screen. Although Cophny is a fictional character, in many ways this confrontation is a fulfillment of what Jesus warned his apostles about back in episode 2 of this season, when he told them that he came to set man against his father, and daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be members of his own household, which is quoting Matthew chapter 10, verse 35. Technically, Jesus didn't mention any father-in-laws there, but the point remains the same. Thomas and Rama thought they'd experienced the full brunt of Cophny's hatred before, but now it has only intensified. And although Thomas and Rama never truly married in the show, here we see that Cophny, who is as good as his father-in-law, has nothing but hate for him and publicly declares him his enemy. This is the cost of following Jesus. And while I know gratitude at a time like this would be hard, I know for a fact that Coffney's gotta be grateful that Rama wasn't intending to marry Z, because if he had yelled at Z like he'd yelled at Thomas, we all know that probably wouldn't have ended nearly as smoothly. The fifth thing we have in this episode is Rapid Fire Miracle Worker. After the events in Tel Dor, the episode cuts to a montage that spans a huge chunk of time, and fittingly so if the show is going to get us to Passion Week by season 5. During this time lapse, we get to see Jesus perform several miracles, many of which reflect some which we see detailed in Scripture, and all of which provide a good summation of Jesus' ministry as it is presented in the Gospels. We see Jesus casting out demons from a man he encounters along the road, and healing the blind beggar in the town square of Capernaum. We also see him preaching in the courts, growing crowds, and being scrutinized by Jews and Romans alike. All of these are accurate portrayals of Christ's ministry as detailed in the Gospels. The sixth biblical thing we have in this episode after the time jump is a grief observed. As Thomas and Peter reflect on their mutual grief after the time jump, Peter begins to quote the text of Psalm 77. I remember God, and I am disturbed. I muse, and my spirit faints. You have held my eyelids open. This is a perfect psalm to authentically demonstrate faithfully seeking God even when it is the last thing you want to do, seeking to find hope in Him even when your heart wants only to despair. The seventh biblical thing we have in this episode is ominous predictions. Little James and Thaddeus bring up the fact that, as of late, Jesus has been speaking more and more of a time when he is gone, predicting that he must suffer many things at the hands of the elders and chief priests. This is an accurate reflection of this point in Jesus' ministry. Beginning immediately after Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, which we saw in episode 2 of this season, we read that from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised up on the third day. Later on in the episode, when he is rebuking James and John, Jesus uses their rash request to segue into his most specific prophecy yet. We read this account in Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 through 19, which biblically speaking is located in the verses immediately preceding James and John's request, which we also see in this episode. We read this. And as Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves, and on the way he said to them, Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will deliver him over to the Gentiles to mock and flog and crucify him, and on the third day he will be raised up. As Jesus' ministry neared its end, he foretold to his disciples on several occasions exactly what was coming. The eighth biblical thing that we have in this episode is the journey to Jerusalem. When little James mentions Jesus suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests, he acknowledges that those people aren't in Capernaum, coming to the conclusion that they will be traveling soon. Jesus says little James is correct and confirms that soon they will be heading to Jerusalem, where the elders and chief priests are located, and there things will no longer be simple. While the Gospel of John details many of Jesus' trips to Jerusalem, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, choose to instead only detail one trip to Jerusalem, so that when you read their Gospels, the city itself has a foreboding reputation of the place that kills the prophets. When you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Jesus begins to make his way to Jerusalem, you know he is heading there to die. In fact, Luke makes his account the most dramatic of all, dedicating 10 whole chapters, chapter 9, verse 51, through chapter 19, verse 44, to Jesus' journey to the holy city, known to scholars as the Lucan travelogue. That being said, when you see Jerusalem in the Synoptic Gospels, it carries the same ominous weight that James and Thaddeus are feeling in this scene. The ninth biblical thing we have in this episode is, that's exactly what I said. As Gaius is proclaiming his faith to Peter and Matthew, he confesses that he is unworthy and that they have no idea the things that he has done, to which Peter said, that's exactly what I said. This calls back to when Jesus first called Peter out of the fishing boat, to which Peter replied, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. That's in Luke chapter 5, verse 8. This interaction is such a beautiful portrayal of the gospel, a bunch of unworthy people marred by unholy actions, thoughts, and desires, unified by their conviction that they want to serve the only one who truly is worthy of all things. The 10th biblical thing we have in this episode is Salome's request, but this time we're talking about Salome, the mother of James and John, not Salome, the daughter of Herodias, like we were back in episode 1. The last few episodes have been setting up a biblical moment that we finally see take place in this episode. In Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45, we read this. Then James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus, saying to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory. But Jesus said to them, You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, We are able. And Jesus said to them, The cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." In hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John, and calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." In Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 28, we read the same exact story, but with one key difference. It is Salome, the mother of James and John, not the boys themselves, who makes the request. This is why, over the last few episodes, Salome has been the one encouraging the boys to make the request. It was the Chosen's way of blending the two stories together. And speaking of blending two stories together, we arrive at our 11th biblical thing, which is the faithful Roman. This episode at long last saw the adaptation of a biblical story fans have been waiting to see for quite some time, with Gaius officially transforming from a purely fictional character to a biblical character. While this isn't necessarily my favorite biblical moment from The Chosen, it is one of the best and most satisfying emotional moments from the entire show, and the way that they managed to weave two separate different biblical accounts into one is so impressive that it makes my inner Bible nerd squeal with delight. Before we talk about the scene itself, let's read the two passages that they wove together. The first account is found in both Matthew and Luke, the latter of which reads thus: "When he had completed all his words in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. And a centurion's slave, who was highly regarded by him, was sick and about to die. Now when he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his slave. And when they came to Jesus, they were earnestly pleading with him, saying, 'He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue.' Now Jesus was going on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, 'Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not good enough for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it.' Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him. And he turned to the crowd that was following him and said, 'I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith.' And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health." That's Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. The second account comes from John chapter 4. "Then he came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And there was a royal official whose son was sick at Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and was asking him to come down and heal his son, for he was about to die. So Jesus said to him, 'Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe.' The royal official said to him, 'Sir, come down before my child dies.' Jesus said to him, 'Go, your son lives.' The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started on his way. And while he was still going down, his slaves met him, saying that his son was alive. So he inquired of them the hour when he had begun to get better. And they said to him, 'Yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him.' So the father knew it was the hour in which Jesus said to him, 'Your son lives.' And he himself believed in his whole household. This is again a second sign that Jesus did when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. And that's John chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. The first account takes place in Capernaum, and it involves the slave of a centurion. The second account takes place in Cana, but it involves a royal official's son who is in Capernaum. Both stories take place outside while Jesus is traveling, and both feature a Roman with enough faith to ask Jesus to heal from a distance, though in one story, the Roman actually comes to Jesus, while in the other story, he doesn't actually come to Jesus, but sends a bunch of people to him. In the first account, Jesus praises the man for his faith, saying it is superior to all the faith he has found in Israel. In the second account, we don't see what Jesus really thinks of the man's faith, but we do get to see the man's reaction to learning about his son's healing. While changing a few of the more minor details, The Chosen manages to blend these two stories together seamlessly, making it so that Gaius is both a centurion and a royal official, the sick boy is both his servant and his son, and the other details are blended together to unify the whole thing into a singular account. From an artistic perspective, it's absolutely brilliant, and made even better by Kirk Waller's fantastic acting in the scene. From the moment he confesses his faith to Peter and Matthew, you can feel the joy of Christ and the assurance of his hope in Christ bouncing off of him more than any other character we've seen in the show thus far, making it totally understandable why Jesus would say that his faith is unlike anything he has encountered in all Israel. They really do a good job at setting him apart. It might very well be one of my favorite scenes of the entire show, and Gaius might just very well be my favorite character from this point going forward. All the stuff we see him doing afterward is entirely fictional, but I love all of it. From buying toys for his kid, giving extra change to the merchant, blowing out candles of his pagan idols, his reunion with his sons, the list goes on and on. It's all perfect, perfect, perfect. The 12th and final biblical thing we have in this episode is no soundness in my flesh. At the very end of the episode, shortly before Jesus' emotional breakdown, he can be heard muttering the words of Psalm 38 as he sets his backpack on the ground. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. That's Psalm 38:3. Notably, since the next few verses involve David explaining that his hardship arises from his own sin, Jesus skips these verses since he has no sin. He picks up in verse 8. I am faint and badly crushed. I groan because of the agitation of my heart. Lord, all my desire is before you, and my sighing is not hidden from you. My heart throbs, my strength forsakes me, and the light of my eyes, even that has gone from me. My loved ones and my friends stand aloof from my plague, and my kinsmen stand afar off. And then, after saying these things, Jesus breaks down and weeps. This brings us to our historical section, which accounts for stuff that isn't in the Bible, but is found elsewhere in historical research. The first historical thing we have is Latin lessons. During Quintus's demotion and Gaius's promotion, you might hear some Latin phrases you aren't familiar with. As he is given a sentence, Quintus is told that he is hereby reduced in rank, gratius diectio, and relegated to a lesser service, militae mutatio, to be determined at tribunal. Gratis diectio means to step down, while militae mutatio means military change. In other words, the Latin words are simply conveying what's already been said in English. He is being forced to step down from his current office, being reduced to a lesser military rank to be determined later whenever he actually stands trial. A few moments later, when Atticus sees Gaius, he says the words festina lente, which means make haste slowly. This was a classical oxymoronic adage that traces back to the Greek phrase spude bradeos. According to Roman history, Emperor Augustus despised well-trained leaders acting with haste or rashness, and so make haste slowly became one of his favorite phrases. Essentially, the phrase is suggesting that tasks should be performed urgently, yet diligently. If you move with too much haste, you'll mess up the job. In many ways, this simple phrase is Atticus's way of summarizing the culmination of Quintus's time as praetor. He sought glory so much that he let his emotions get the best of himself, and he tried to make haste too quickly. The second historical thing we have in this episode is Jewish burial customs. While Rhema's death was fictional, the way the show depicts Jesus and the apostles transferring her body afterwards is an accurate representation of ancient Jewish burial customs. While it isn't depicted in the show, a group of men and women known as the Shevra Kadisha, or the Sacred Society, would perform the rite of tahara, or purification, cleansing the body and covering it in a burial shroud. If the body needed to be transferred somewhere, as we see in the episode, typically the body would be laid face up on a bier, covered with the burial shroud. Friends and relatives would walk in procession, transferring the deceased to the burial location. While the apostles didn't do it in the scene, on occasion people would even hire professional mourners or flute players, just as we see when Jairus' daughter died in season 3, and as we will see again when we arrive at the story of Lazarus later on in this season. Upon arriving at the burial site, the body would be transferred to the tomb itself, where the final rites would be performed. The third historical thing that we have in this episode is Jewish graffiti. After leaving Tel Dor, the apostles make their way south, where they come across a signpost with the name Jerusalem inscribed in Latin. There is some red graffiti just below the inscription which reads, Yeshua hu Mashiach, Jesus is Messiah. While we don't have any evidence of ancient Jewish graffiti pronouncing Jesus as Messiah, ancient Jews, just like other cultures, weren't beyond writing graffiti in places, and this is something The Chosen has been depicting since its very first episode. One fun little curiosity that you might have missed in this episode is that it looks like Tamar is reading the graffiti as well. The last time we heard her talking about reading and writing in The Chosen, she said that she was illiterate, and so maybe she's learned to read, or maybe this is a continuity error. Speaking of continuity errors, our fourth historical thing is Kislev AD 30. After the montage comes to a close, the text on screen tells us that we are now in the month of Kislev, which accounts for late November and early December according to our calendars. It also tells us that we're in the year AD 30, but I'm assuming this has to be a typo since most scholars hold that Jesus died during Passover of either AD 30 or 33, and in the past the Chosen has made it clear that they are going with the AD 30 date. And sure enough, after I saw this in theaters, I texted my buddy Brandon Snipe to see what he thought about this, and he texted Dallas Jenkins and the Chosen team, and they did confirm that this was in fact a typo, and it should say Kislev of AD 29. If this truly were Kislev of AD 30, that is November or December of AD 30, then Jesus would have died 9 months earlier, which is a bit of a problem, safe to say. So actually, this is supposed to be Kislev of AD 29, which means that, in the context of the show, we are roughly 3.5 months away from Jesus' death. It also means that, even if you bump it back to AD 29 instead of AD 30, the time jump that we just saw was a huge one. I've spent countless and countless hours looking into the Chosen's timeline and trying to make it work, and if you've actually seen my video discussing the Chosen's timeline, you'll know that chronology has been a bit of an issue with the show, a running gag that I do like to make fun of as much as I can. The text back in Season 1 told us that it began in AD 26, which makes sense since most people hold that Jesus had a 3.5-year-long ministry, setting him up to die in March or April of AD 30. However, even in that video that I made, you'll remember that, after following the chronological details of the show, and despite adding huge time jumps at any place I possibly could, by the end of Season 3, we were only in early April of AD 28. In other words, Season 1, Episode 1 through Season 3, Episode 8 span 1.5 years from mid-August of AD 26 through early April of AD 28, and that's with all the time jumps that I had to add into the show. Since context clues from the beginning of Season 4 suggest to us that not much time has passed, characters are still reacting fairly freshly to the events of the Season 3 finale, it's safe to say that Season 4 begins in late April or early May of AD 28. That means that, in order to get from AD 28 to November of AD 29, that short montage that we see in this episode had to span yet another 1.5 years. This seems a bit long to me, and Thomas and Peter's conversation immediately after the montage suggests it's only been a few months, but if we are following the show's chronology, it genuinely has to be that long. This means that the montage itself spanned just as much time as all 3 prior seasons of the show had covered, and that's only if we include all the time jumps I inserted into the first 3 seasons. To make matters even worse, if we insist that the text on screen in this episode isn't a typo, and that we actually are in Kislev of AD 30, then the time jump was actually 2.5 years long, which is absolutely bonkers. That all being said, I'll stop ranting about the chronology and just say it here. Kislev of AD 30 is almost historical, while Kislev of AD 29 is absolutely historical. The 5th and final historical thing we have in this episode is olive presses. The olive press we see at the end of the episode is a picture-perfect representation of what ancient olive presses could have looked like. The first step involved crushing the olives, which would have been accomplished with a rolling stone set on an axis in a grooved basin, rotated in a circle by a horizontal handle pushed by humans or animals. This stone would have crushed the olives, and while there are various methods of extracting the actual oil itself, the method we see in this episode is a lever-based press, wherein a basket of crushed olives was placed into a basin and topped with a heavy crushing stone, which in turn was topped by a wooden lever. One by one, heavy stones would be tied to the end of the lever, pressing down on the crushing stone and forcing the olive oil to seep out, just as we see in the episode. Fortunately, the olive pressing business was a lot less emotional to engage in when you weren't wrestling through your impending death and the sacrifice for the sake of all mankind. This brings us to our probable section, which accounts for stuff that isn't directly confirmed in the Bible or historical records, but is likely to have occurred based on educated guesses derived from biblical and historical research. The first probable thing we have is craving alone time with Jesus. Little James and Thaddeus admit that they miss the old days when it was just them and Jesus. While we know next to nothing about the historical Little James and Thaddeus, what we can say is probable is that when Jesus was at the height of his popularity, I imagine many of his family members, friends, and closest disciples craved to go back to a time when things were more normal, when things were more simple. While his family certainly had ulterior motives in this scene, we may even get a slight hint of this at one occasion in Scripture where we read that, while Jesus was still speaking to the crowds, behold, his mother and brothers were standing outside seeking to speak to him. Now someone said to him, behold, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak to you. Like Thaddeus and little James in the scene, Jesus' family sought to relate to them how they once had in the past. But as Jesus communicates to little James and Thaddeus, he didn't have the luxury of going back. Going back to the biblical account, this is what we read. But Jesus answered the one who was telling him and said, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, behold my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother. As Jesus stepped closer and closer to his destiny, I imagine it was difficult for all of those who were closest to him. The only other probable thing I have in this episode is Jesus' panic attack. Originally, I thought panic attack might be too severe of a term to use here, but upon rewatching the episode, I'm not too sure. The end of this episode sees Jesus wrestling through the heavy burden of his coming sacrifice, and while this event itself is a fictional creation of the show, I imagine it isn't too dissimilar from what Jesus likely experienced on several occasions throughout his ministry. In many ways, this scene is a precursor to Jesus' agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, which will take place on the eve of his crucifixion, but even prior to that, in John chapter 12, verse 27, we read Jesus say, now my soul has become dismayed. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Even before then, in the events of Luke chapter 12, some of which were adapted in episode 3, Jesus said, but I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it is finished. In this verse in particular, Jesus makes it sound like his entire ministry was plagued by the burden of knowing his suffering was coming, and day by day he was being strained like an olive in a press. Sure enough, the name Gethsemane literally means oil press, and as Jesus watches the oil be pressed out in this episode, his body quakes under the burden of the cup he knows he must drink. I think it's very probable that Jesus went through things like this quite often, though we typically fail to consider it. This brings us to our plausible section, which accounts for stuff that isn't necessarily probable or improbable, but is possible. In other words, information conceivable to have occurred given biblical and historical evidence. The first of these is John and Thomas's friendship. In John's flashback, James explains how he'd felt envious of John and Thomas's budding friendship ever since John and Thomas got back from their mission. While John and Thomas being paired for their mission is a fictional creation of the show, there might be some historical evidence to suggest that the two were close. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts each mention Thomas only one time in each of their respective lists of the 12 apostles. By contrast, however, the Gospel of John mentions Thomas on 4 different occasions, in chapter 11, shortly before the resurrection of Lazarus, in chapter 14, asking a question during the Last Supper, in chapter 20, where his worship of the resurrected Christ serves as the climax of the entire Gospel, and in chapter 21, where he is present with 6 other disciples when the resurrected Jesus appears to them yet again. John's emphasis on Thomas doesn't necessarily prove that the two shared a special bond like that portrayed in the show, but it does suggest that such a friendship certainly was a possibility. The only other plausible thing I found for this episode is early disciples. The show presents little James and Thaddeus as being the first disciples to meet Jesus, something which we are most likely going to get flashbacks of in future seasons. Biblically and historically speaking, we know next to nothing about little James and Thaddeus, and so there's no historical reason to believe that this was actually the case. But one thing that is plausible is that Jesus knew some of his disciples prior to them actually becoming his disciples. The Bible doesn't tell us much about Jesus prior to his ministry, but it is plausible that he had encountered several of his disciples prior to the events wherein we meet them in Scripture. And some scholars even argue that he might have been related to some of the disciples, though that is up for some debate. This brings us to our hypothetical section, which accounts for fictional additions, storylines, or plot elements added to the show, usually for the sake of drama, continuity, artistic license, creative freedom, reaching a modern audience, or to connect storylines. The first hypothetical thing we have is rank shift. The episode opens with some major shifts in the Roman ranks, with Quintus being demoted while Gaius is, unexpectedly to both Gaius and the audience, promoted to praetor. Since all the Roman characters, including Atticus, Quintus, Gaius, and Julius, are fictional, their rank shifts are fictional as well, though it seems likely that they are very possibly put in place very intentionally by the showrunners. As we see in this episode, Gaius officially crossed the boundary from fictional character to biblical character, and this rank shift could be setting up more of the others. I wouldn't be too surprised if we encounter Quintus again down in Jerusalem in season 6, relegated to the lowly position of nailing criminals to crosses. Who knows? Maybe he'll even be the one who recognizes at long last that Jesus truly is the Son of God. The second hypothetical thing we have is the aftermath of Rhema's death. As we've mentioned several times already, Rhema was a character created for the show, and so her death and its immediate aftermath, which we see in this episode, are all likewise fictional, created for the purpose of character development, to flesh out biblical insights, or to set up other biblical moments. The early minutes of this episode explore different characters' reactions to the events of the last episode, but all of these are purely fictional. The third hypothetical thing we have is Romans seeking Matthew. One of the key biblical events of this episode is set in motion by Praetor Gaius seeking out Matthew. As I've already mentioned, Gaius is a fictional character, and we don't have any evidence of Roman praetors seeking out disciples of Jesus, though I will admit that the story has some reminiscent parallels to that of the Roman centurion Cornelius, who we read about in Acts chapter 10. Given those parallels, I think it's really cool that Peter joined Matthew to go and see Gaius, though again, it's all fictional. The final hypothetical thing we have in this episode is that hug. Alright, I'm gonna be honest, I just needed to find a place to mention the hug at the end of this episode. It's one of my favorite moments of the entire series, two of the best actors in the show expressing a wide range of emotions all in a single embrace, but unfortunately, it's purely fictional. In fact, I find it humbling to consider the fact that, during the days of his incarnation, Christ bore his burden alone, and there were probably many times when he really could have used that hug, but no one knew to give it. But in the show, at least he has Gaius. This brings us to our improbable section, events which are unlikely to have occurred based on educated guesses derived from biblical and historical research. The first one is the God who walks on water. During John's flashback at the beginning of the episode, Peter says that I trust in a God that walks on water. This is a super epic line that I absolutely love, but historically speaking, as I've mentioned in previous videos, it's pretty improbable that the apostles had a full grasp of Christ's divinity at this point in his ministry, and even if they did, they probably wouldn't have spoken about it so bluntly. Even whenever you read the New Testament itself, the text refers to Christ's divinity in veiled ways steeped in the Hebrew scriptures and the Hebrew mindset, explicitly calling Jesus the title God only on a handful of occasions. That all being said, for the sake of the show, I 100% understand why they put lines like this in there, because they're epic one-liners that are great for storytelling on one hand, but in a world that is filled with so many debates over exactly who Jesus is, one-liners like this also serve to communicate to a general audience who exactly the creators of the show believe Jesus to be. Not just a man, not just a rabbi, not just a king, not just the Messiah, but God in the flesh. And so, as historically improbable as this line is, I think it's one of the coolest and clearest lines of the show, and I appreciate that they put it in there. And I've got some good news for you, because for the second week in a row, we have nothing in the ahistorical section, and as has been the trend since the very beginning of the show, we have nothing in the heretical section, so that brings this episode of Is It Biblical to a close. In my opinion, the back half of this episode is one of the Chosen's strongest to date, masterfully weaving together several biblical storylines in a manner that it was faithful to the text, consistent with the tone and progression of the show, and expert in resolving certain storylines while setting others in place. Episodes like this are a perfect example of why The Chosen has become so popular, because it manages to be both faithful to scripture while also artistically beautiful and curious all at once. That being said, if you haven't liked this video already, be sure to do so that YouTube can know that videos like this are worth watching, and be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so that you know when other videos like this are coming your way. Also, if you like this video and you want some more of my longer form biblical content unrelated to The Chosen, like sermons and Bible studies and whatnot, you can go get those at my other YouTube channel known as David Tate, available at the link in the description down below. I don't really promote that channel as much, but I've been told I should do it some more, and so that's what I'm doing. Until next time, my name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face, don't let anybody steal your joy, and of course, remember who you are.